She did not run. Running would have implied she was afraid, and she was not afraid she was done. There is a specific difference between those two things. And Seraphine understood it completely in the moment she turned her back on the ceremonial hall, on the assembled court, on the man who had looked at the floor instead of at her face, and walked into the cold mountain night with nothing she had been given in 2 years of waiting, and everything she had arrived with. The palace lights fell away below her as the path climbed. Above her, the stars were opening wider, brighter, closer than they ever looked from the valley, the sky at altitude a different sky entirely. She pressed her palm to the mountain's cold rock. The stars showed her everything. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story travels. The court had never given her a title. This was the foundational fact of Seraphine's daily existence in the palace, not dramatic, not cruel in any single identifiable act, but consistently present in the specific way that institutional ambiguity was consistently present. In the seating arrangements that placed her adjacent to significance without including her in it. In the record books that listed the court's formal members and contained a blank where her designation would have been. In the specific quality of attention people paid her in rooms present enough to register, insufficient to constitute recognition. She had arrived 2 years ago as a consequence of a diplomatic arrangement between her home province and the crown, not a formal court appointment, not a bonded placement, but one of those administrative adjacencies that large courts accumulated without ever deciding to. She had useful skills. She was meticulous. She could read and write in 4 languages. She had a precise and organized mind that the court's record-keeping operation had absorbed immediately and gratefully without ever formalizing the absorption. She copied documents. She maintained correspondence logs. She cross-referenced the court's historical records with incoming administrative reports and identified discrepancies that saved the Treasury significant amounts annually, for which she received neither acknowledgement nor payment, only the continuation of her ambiguous residency. She lived in a room on the palace's eastern wing, small, stone-walled, with one window that faced northeast. The window was the most important feature of the room. At night, through that window, she could see a specific sector of sky that corresponded to the northern and eastern borders. She had never told anyone what she saw through that window. Her daily routine was structured around invisibility as a protective strategy. She rose before most of the court, completed her record work in the hours when the administrative wing was quiet, ate at the common table without drawing attention, and retreated to her room by the time the court's social machinery was operating at full volume. She was not shy, she was careful. There was a difference. King Evander's presence in her daily life was the one element that did not fit the invisibility strategy, and that she had never successfully resolved into anything manageable. He sought her out, not dramatically, not in the performed way of a man making a declaration, in the quiet way of someone who kept finding reasons to be in the rooms she was in, who asked her questions about the record-keeping that required answers somewhat longer than the questions seemed to merit, who occasionally arrived at the small courtyard she used for her midday break and sat on the opposite bench and read his own correspondence while she read hers. And neither of them acknowledged that he had come specifically because she was there. She knew he had. He knew she knew. This had been their arrangement for 2 years. It was warm and specific and entirely without formal definition, and the court watched it with the particular attention that courts gave to things that were not yet official, calculating what they might become and positioning accordingly. Lord Hadron, the chief advisor, had been calculating with visible displeasure for approximately 18 months. Seraphine had noticed this and had noted it as a risk factor and had done nothing to address it because she had understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent their life reading situations from the margins, that addressing it directly would require naming what she and Evander were to each other. And naming it required him to name it first, and he had not named it. She had been waiting for him to name it. The stars through her window at night showed her things she did not speak about. She had learned early before the court, before Evander, in her home province. As a child who had pointed at the sky and described what she saw there in terms no one around her had a framework for, that the gift was most safely kept silent. Not because it was dangerous exactly, but because explaining it required the other person to believe something they had no evidence for beyond her word. And her word was not the kind of word that people with power over her outcomes had historically found sufficient. She had tried once. The village elder at age 9. He had been kind about not believing her, which was its own particular wound. So the window sky she kept to herself. It showed her, had always shown her, the strategic architecture of the territory below it. Troop movements registered as specific distortions in particular star clusters. Supply lines appeared as luminous threads between points. The emotional condition of large groups, the specific quality of an army's fear or confidence or readiness to act, showed in the color register of the nearest relevant stars. She watched the northern border's star cluster every night and kept her own private notation and did nothing with what she saw. In the autumn of her second year at court, she had tried once to mention what the northern stars were showing her to Evander. They had been in the courtyard evening, the session going longer than usual. She had pointed at a specific grouping above the northern horizon and described, briefly and carefully, what she observed there, a clustering she had been watching for 3 weeks that she read as significant troop consolidation. He had looked at the stars. He had looked at her. He had said, "Those are very bright tonight." She had said, "Yes." She had not tried again. The blood moon ceremony was announced on a Tuesday, 6 weeks before the actual event. The blood moon was the calendar's most significant ceremonial occasion, the night on which the pax bonds and standings were formally acknowledged before the assembled court, which meant it was the night on which the absence of formal acknowledgement was also, by the ceremony's own logic, made visible. She understood what the announcement meant immediately. She had 6 weeks to decide whether to leave before the ceremony or to stay and find out what Evander would do. She stayed. She had always been someone who needed to know what she was looking at, even when looking cost her something. She had been 8 years old the first time the stars showed her something specific. Her family's home province was in the northeastern territory, on a hill that rose above the valley floor far enough to give the night sky a specific clarity, the horizon unobstructed. The altitude slight, but sufficient to affect what she could see. She had been lying on her back in the field behind the house on a summer night, watching the stars with the open, uncategorizing attention of a child who has not yet learned that some things are not worth watching, when the 3 star clusters above the eastern horizon shifted. Not physically. The stars themselves did not move. But their relationship to each other changed in a way she perceived directly and completely. The way she perceived temperature or sound, a quality of the experience, rather than a conclusion drawn from it. The eastern cluster pulled together, tighter, with a specific density that she would spend years developing language for, but which, at 8, she simply received as, something is gathering there. 3 days later, the border clan from the Eastern Valley made a raid on 2 of the province's outer farms. Nobody connected the stars to the raid. Why would they? She had not told anyone what she had seen, because she had not yet understood that she had seen something distinct from what everyone else saw when they looked at the same sky. She thought everyone experienced the stars this way. She thought the gathering she had felt in the eastern cluster was simply the sky's way of announcing what was happening below it, the way clouds announced rain. It took approximately 4 years of careful, private observation to understand that this was not the case. The gifts' mechanics, as she understood them after 20 years of practice. The stars reflected the large-scale movement of living beings below them in specific registrable ways. Not individual people. She could not see a single person's movement in the sky, any more than a map showed individual footprints. What she saw was strategic architecture, The shape of things. Concentrations of people moving with coordinated purpose produce specific distortions in the star clusters directly above the relevant territory. Supply lines appeared as luminous threads barely visible, requiring sustained attention, but unmistakable once she had learned to look for them. The emotional condition of large groups registered as color shifts in the relevant stars, the cold blue of confident forces, the orange-red uncertainty of troops that had received contradictory orders, the flat silver of an army that had decided to wait. She had mapped all of this privately over 20 years. She had 5 star sectors memorized: northern, northeastern, eastern, southeastern, and southern. The western sector she could read less clearly from most positions. The gift seemed to work best with stars above the horizon rather than those near it. And the western stars in her home province had always been too low. At the palace, the watchtower had a western orientation that she had looked at once, and then deliberately not returned to, because the western star cluster had shown her something she was not ready to act on. At age 12 she told her mother about the eastern cluster's behavior before a neighbor clan's cattle dispute escalated into a week-long conflict. Her mother listened carefully and then said, "Seraphine, you have a powerful imagination, and you should be careful about the stories you tell yourself about it." This was said kindly. It was still a door closing. At 15 she recorded a border skirmish 3 days before it happened by watching the northeastern cluster shift and consolidate in the specific pattern she had by then reliably associated with imminent armed movement. She told no one. The skirmish occurred exactly as she had read it in the stars. She sat with this information alone and understood, with the specific clarity of 15, that the choice between telling and not telling was not about the accuracy of what she saw. It was about whether the person she told had any framework for receiving it. She had not, in 20 years, found a person with that framework. She had come close once. Evander, in the courtyard, pointing at the northern cluster and beginning to describe the 3-week consolidation pattern she had been watching. He had looked at the stars. He had said they were very bright. She had understood, from the quality of his response, that he was not dismissing her. He simply did not know how to look at what she was pointing at, had no perceptual language for it, was seeing a sky where she was seeing a map. He had been kind. She had not tried again. What she had never told him, had never told anyone, was that the night sky above the palace showed her 5 borders simultaneously. And what she saw on all 5 of them, on the night of the blood moon announcement, was movement. Not yet invasion pace movement. Consolidation. The specific pulling together of star clusters that preceded organized action. On 3 borders at once, northern, eastern, and southeastern, she saw the slow, patient gathering of forces that, in her experience, meant something was being planned. She had been watching this for 6 weeks. She had been watching it in silence, through her small northeastern window. Noting it on a piece of paper she kept folded inside her record-keeping journal. While below her the court prepared its ceremony, and Lord Hadron planned his public accounting of her standing, and Evander said nothing to anyone about what she was to him. She had been watching the kingdom's threat landscape consolidate in the stars while she waited for a man to name her. On the night of the blood moon, as she climbed the mountain path with nothing she had been given and everything she had arrived with, she pressed her palm to the rock and looked up, and the stars showed her all 5 borders at once for the first time, altitude opening the gift like a door she had been knocking at for 20 years. The western cluster, finally visible above the horizon, had a 4th movement in it that she had not been able to see from the valley. She stopped climbing and stared at it. She said, to the empty mountain air, to nobody, "There are 4. The blood moon ceremony had been designed, in its original form, as a celebration. This was what the court's historical records said. Seraphine had read them, because she had read everything in the court's historical records during 2 years of meticulous archival maintenance. And the blood moon's founding documentation described it as a night of acknowledgement and affirmation. when the pack gathered to recognize the bonds that held it together and the people who carried those bonds. The original ceremony had been inclusive in the way of things designed by people who understood that. A community's strength was not diminished by the breadth of its recognition. What the blood moon ceremony had become, over the generations of the court's particular institutional evolution, was a precise formal accounting of standing, who was bonded to whom, under what designation, with what formal acknowledgement. Which meant it was also, by the ceremony's own inexorable logic, a precise formal accounting of who was not. She had understood this when the announcement was made. She had understood it more specifically when, in the 2 weeks following the announcement, she had observed the specific quality of Lord Hadron's attention to her, the particular calculating regard of someone who had found an instrument and was planning its use. She stayed anyway. The night of the blood moon, the great hall decorated in the ceremony's traditional red and gold, the assembled court in formal standing order. The blood moon's light coming through the high windows in its specific deep red that gave the ceremony its name and its atmosphere. Seraphine had dressed carefully, not in performance, because she did not perform for audiences that had decided what they were looking at, but in the specific self-respect of a woman who understood that the way she presented herself was the only element of the evening she could control. She had stood in the gallery section, not the main floor, where bonded pairs and formally designated court members stood, but the gallery where observers and visiting dignitaries and the court's various adjacent presences occupied the space above the main event. She had stood there quietly and watched the ceremony proceed through its formal acknowledgments with the patient attention she brought to everything she observed. Evander was at the ceremony's head, in the position the ceremony required, conducting the formal acknowledgments with the composed authority of a man who had done this many times and understood its weight. She watched him perform the ceremony's requirements with the specific quality of attention she always brought to watching him, the attention of someone who had spent 2 years learning a person, without ever being permitted to name what the learning was for. Lord Hadron stepped forward at the ceremony's midpoint. She had known it was coming. She had known it specifically since the previous Tuesday, when she had observed Hadron reviewing the court's formal standing registry with the focused concentration of someone looking for a specific entry. She had known what he would find, or rather, what he would not find. He addressed the assembly in the language of official record-keeping, which was the language she herself used in her daily work and which she therefore understood with complete precision. He said, "The court's formal standing registry contains certain entries that require clarification for the record's accuracy." He said, "There is presently an individual in residence whose standing designation has not been formally processed through the court's official registry." He provided the relevant administrative details: her name, her province of origin, her duration of residence, and the absence of any formal standing designation in the registry. He did not call her a liar. He did not use any language that was technically cruel. He used the language of administrative accuracy to accomplish something that administrative accuracy was not designed to accomplish. The assembled court heard the gap between what was said and what was meant. Courts were excellent at hearing gaps, and the gallery above shifted with the specific collective awareness of an audience that understood it was witnessing a deliberate act. She stood in the gallery and received it with the stillness she had been practicing her entire life. What she was watching while she received it was Evander. He was 12 feet away, in the ceremony's central position, with the full court between them and the blood moon's red light falling across his face. She could see his expression clearly. She had spent 2 years learning to read the specific vocabulary of his face, the difference between the public composure he maintained in formal settings and the quality of his private attention. The specific way his jaw set when he was processing something he had not expected. The particular stillness that preceded his most honest responses. She watched him receive Hadron's announcement. She watched him understand what it was. She watched him look at the floor. She had been preparing herself, in some private part of her awareness, for multiple possible responses. She had prepared for intervention the specific scenario in which he stepped forward and named her formally, which would have been the action of a man who had decided. She had prepared for visible discomfort the scenario in which his conflict was visible on his face and in his body, which would have told her something different and not nothing. She had prepared for a range of things. She had not prepared adequately for the floor. Not because it was the worst of the options, it was not a deliberate cruelty, and she had always understood that. It was the specific failure of a man who felt things he could not commit to naming, who prioritized his own discomfort over her dignity, who chose the path of least personal difficulty in a moment that required him to choose something more costly. She understood all of this accurately and immediately because she had spent 2 years learning him, and what she understood was, this was his answer. Not the answer to Hadron's administrative action. The answer to the question she had been waiting 2 years for him to address. He was not certain enough to stand up for her. He had been given every reason for 2 years to become certain, and he had chosen the comfort of uncertainty over the difficulty of commitment. And the blood moon ceremony was simply the moment when that choice had produced its visible consequence. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in public spaces, and the emotion she was experiencing was not, in any case, the kind of thing that translated into tears. It was colder and more clarifying than that the specific temperature of a door closing, a question answered, a waiting period concluded. She left the gallery. She left the hall. She took the mountain path from the palace's northern gate, and she did not look back, and the blood moon rose behind her as she climbed, and the stars opened above her, and she pressed her palm to the cold mountain rock and felt the gift open completely for the first time in 20 years of careful suppression. The stars showed her everything. 4 movements, 3 borders already consolidating, 1 western front she had not been able to see from the valley, now visible at altitude. Smaller than the others but oriented and deliberate. She stood on the mountain path in the blood moon's red light and looked at the complete strategic picture of the kingdom's threat landscape and understood 2 things simultaneously. The first, the kingdom was in serious danger from multiple directions, and the only person who could see the full shape of it was standing on a mountain path in the dark with nothing she had been given and everything she had arrived with. The second, that was not her problem tonight. Tonight she was going to climb to the highest point the mountain offered and let the stars show her everything they had been waiting to show her, and she was going to watch. And she was going to rest in the cold, clear air at the place where the gift had always been designed to operate. What she did with what she saw was a question for later. She climbed. She reached the highest accessible point on the 6th day. Not the physical summit, the true summit was above the treeline and beyond the altitude where sustained work was possible, where the cold became a physiological problem rather than a clarifying condition. But the high plateau, approximately 2,000 feet above the valley floor, with an unobstructed view of all 5 horizon sectors and the specific quality of sky that altitude produced the atmosphere thinner, the stars closer, the gift operating at a depth she had never accessed from the valley's constraint. The first night she had simply lain on her back on the flat rock at the plateau's center and let the gift run without direction, without suppression, without the careful management she had practiced for 20 years in spaces that required her to contain what she saw. What she experienced was the difference between a window and an open sky. All 5 sectors visible simultaneously. The northern cluster directly above, the eastern and northeastern clusters to her right, the southeastern and southern clusters along the lower arc, and the western horizon previously inaccessible from the valley's geography, rising clear and complete to her left. She could read all 5 at once, her perception moving between them the way a reader's eyes moved between lines of a page, each sector carrying its own information. The total picture available to her as a unified strategic landscape for the first time in her life. She had wept, briefly and privately, not from grief but from the specific relief of a person who has been carrying something in a confined space for 20 years and has finally been given room to put it down and look at its full size. Then she had begun to work. The notation system she developed over the following 5 days was built on the flat stones the plateau provided, thin, smooth, light-colored enough to accept marks from a piece of darker rock she had found at the path's edge. Each stone represented one sector of sky. Each night's reading was recorded in a notation she developed by necessity. A circle for a cluster's standard position, a dot inside for consolidation, a line for a supply thread, a color notation for the emotional register she read in specific stars. The picture that emerged across 5 nights of notation was the clearest and most alarming strategic landscape she had ever read. 3 borders were in active pre-invasion consolidation. The northern cluster had been building for the longest. She had watched this from the valley for 6 weeks. But altitude showed her what the valley view had obscured. The northern consolidation was not one force but 2, coordinated at a distance, which meant a 2-pronged approach rather than a single-front advance. The eastern cluster showed a force that had already committed to its deployment position, not yet moving, but stationary in the specific way of troops waiting for a signal rather than troops in their home territory. The southeastern cluster showed the supply infrastructure of a sustained campaign rather than a raid. The luminous threads she associated with supply lines were dense and organized, suggesting months of logistical preparation. The western cluster was the smallest and the newest. She had first seen it on the blood moon night and had watched it develop each night since. It was a 4th force, not yet at the consolidation density of the other 3, but moving with the specific orientation of something that had made a decision and was following through on it. It was aimed at the kingdom's western border, which was the border the conventional intelligence network considered most secure, which made it the border the conventional intelligence network watched least carefully. She spent the 6th day not working. The GIF's extended full-scale operation had a cost she respected, and the cost of 5 nights of altitude reading was a specific deep exhaustion that was not dangerous but was insistent. She ate, she rested. She watched the daylight stars with the relaxed attention of someone letting an instrument cool after sustained use. She thought about the eastern valleys. The eastern border was the thinnest in terms of conventional military infrastructure, the border most dependent on early warning, where the difference between a timely response and a catastrophic one was measured in days rather than weeks. The eastern cluster's stationary deployment pattern suggested the eastern force was waiting for coordination with the northern advance. When the northern 2-pronged approach moved, the eastern force would move simultaneously. The timing window for an effective eastern defense was approximately 12 days from the moment the northern advance began. And the northern advance, based on what she had watched for 6 weeks, was not far from beginning. The people in the eastern valleys, the farming communities, the border settlements, the villages that had existed on that land for generations were 8 days from a consequence they had not earned and did not know was coming. She looked at her notation stones arranged in their sector order on the flat rock. She was not going back because he needed her. She had been clear with herself about this since the blood moon night. Need was not the same as value, and she was finished being needed without being valued. If she returned to the palace because the king needed her gift, she would have exchanged one form of invisible servitude for another. She was going to stay and watch and give herself the time she required to understand the full shape of what she was seeing. She looked at the eastern sector notation for a long time. She thought about the villages. She said to nobody, to the open sky, to the habit of speaking aloud she had developed on the mountain because 6 days of silence had taught her that her own voice in the cold air was better company than its absence. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now, let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. I am not ready to go back. She looked at the stars. She added, "Not yet." Evander had not slept properly since the blood moon night. This was not a performed condition, not the visible suffering of a man who wanted an audience for his guilt, but the specific, private, entirely unglamorous experience of a person whose sleep had been interrupted by the sustained presence of a thought that would not accept deferral. He had deferred it for 2 years. He had deferred it specifically, and with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that deferral was available as an option and had chosen it consistently over the alternative, which was commitment, which required certainty, which he had never allowed himself to fully reach, because reaching it would have required action, and action would have changed things, and the things as they had been. For 2 years, comfortable enough to choose over the discomfort of change. The floor had been a mistake. He understood this with complete clarity in the 3 seconds after Seraphine left the gallery. He had watched her go with the specific quality of attention he had spent 2 years bringing to her presence. And what he saw in her exit was the answer to a question he had been declining to ask. She was not coming back from this one. Not in the way she had come back from every other smaller ambiguity. Every other instance of his failure to name what she was to him. Every other occasion on which his comfort had cost her something, and she had absorbed the cost and continued. This was different in scale and in kind. And he had understood it in 3 seconds, and had remained where he was for the remainder of the ceremony, because moving would have required him to admit, publicly, what his stillness had already said privately. He was in his private study at dawn the following morning, when the first border report arrived. It was from the Northern Surveillance Post, a weekly report, routine, the kind of document his military secretary normally processed and summarized before it reached him. This one had been flagged for immediate delivery by the post commander, which meant it contained something the commander had assessed as requiring urgent attention. Unusual movement. Northern border, eastern quadrant. Approximately 300 soldiers observed at a position 40 kilometers from the standard patrol route. Nature of movement, organized, not random. Duration of observation, 11 days. 11 days. The report had taken 2 days to reach the capital. The movement had been occurring for 11 days before anyone considered it flag-worthy. And it had taken 2 additional days to reach him, which meant whatever was happening on the northern border's eastern quadrant had been happening for 13 days before he knew about it. He set the report down and picked up the eastern border's most recent summary, a 3-week composite, the standard format, written with the measured language of a military administration that had been trained to describe uncertainty as watchful normality. He read it with the attention he had been applying to everything since the blood moon night, not the comfortable skim of a king who trusted his systems, but the specific focus of a man who was reconsidering whether he had been trusting the right things. The Eastern summary contained a phrase that he read twice. Intermittent border activity consistent with seasonal patrol variation. He thought about what seasonal patrol variation looked like in the eastern sector at this time of year. He thought about what intermittent might mean in the context of a border that was the kingdom's thinnest military infrastructure. He sent for General Marin, his most experienced border commander. Marin arrived within the hour, a compact, direct woman who had spent 30 years managing border assessments and who communicated in the specific compressed language of someone who had learned that clarity was more valuable than reassurance. She reviewed the Northern report, the Eastern summary, and the Southeastern weekly assessment that had arrived the previous day while he had been attending the blood moon ceremony. She read all 3 in sequence. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "These 3 reports are not related in any intelligence I currently have." She said, They may be coincidence. She said, the coincidence bothers me. He said, what would resolve the question? She said, better intelligence, which we do not currently have on any of the three fronts. What we have is fragments that could mean something or nothing, and no way to determine which. He said, and the timeline for resolution through conventional channels. She said, 3 weeks minimum to deploy sufficient additional surveillance to these three sectors. If something is moving on 2 or more of these fronts simultaneously, 3 weeks is time we may not have. He sat with this for a moment. He said, there is a person who may have information about the border situation that exceeds what our conventional surveillance has produced. He said it carefully because he was still in the private part of his thinking that the military crisis had not yet reorganized. Feeling the specific discomfort of a man who was trying not to use a military emergency as a substitute for a personal accountability he had not yet delivered. Marin said, where is this person? He said, the mountain. He said it the way a man said something he had been not saying for several days, and found that the not saying had not made it less true. He sent an emissary that afternoon, a young aide named Kale, competent and perceptive, whose judgment he trusted with the specific sensitivity the situation required. He gave Kale the message, and then he sat in his study as the afternoon's light moved across the wall. And he tried to be honest with himself about the ratio of military urgency to personal need in the decision he had just made. The honest answer was, he was not certain. He was not certain of enough things. He had not been certain of enough things for 2 years. The blood moon night had been the consequence of that pattern. He was aware, in the study's particular quiet, that sending an emissary because the kingdom needed her gift was a continuation of the same pattern, prioritizing what was comfortable over what was honest. What was honest was that he needed to go himself, and he was not ready. And he was using the emissary's superior speed as a reason that was also an excuse. He told himself he would go if Kale came back without her. Outside the study window, the northern stars were rising in the early dusk, and he looked at them and saw bright points of light against a darkening sky and understood nothing about what they were showing him. Kale arrived at the plateau on the 8th day after the blood moon. Seraphine heard him coming for 20 minutes before he arrived. The mountain path's loose stone announced footsteps reliably, and she had developed a specific attentiveness to sounds from below over the past 8 days that was both practical and instinctive. The attentiveness of someone who had chosen a position and was monitoring its security without making monitoring her primary occupation. She was reading the northeastern sector when he crested the plateau's edge, both hands pressed to her largest notation stone. Her attention on the specific star cluster that had shifted in the previous hour toward a configuration she was beginning to associate with the northern two-pronged advance's final consolidation. She did not look up immediately. She finished the notation she was making, and then she looked up. Kale was breathing hard from the climb, and was doing a commendable job of not showing how discomposed the plateau's altitude and cold had made him. He was carrying a sealed document case, the palace's formal correspondence material, the kind used for official communications rather than personal ones. She looked at the document case and then at his face and read the situation completely in approximately 4 seconds. He had been sent officially. The message was framed as a military matter. Evander had not come himself. She said, you should rest before the descent. The path is harder going down than up. He said, I have a message from the king. She said, I know. She said, sit down, Kale. You have been climbing for most of the day. He sat on the flat rock near the path's upper edge with the specific relief of someone whose body had needed to sit for the past hour and who had been maintaining standing posture out of professional obligation. She poured water from her camp vessel and gave it to him, and he drank it gratefully. She looked at the northeast cluster while he recovered. The configuration she had been reading was advancing. The northern two-pronged advance was at the final pre-movement stage. She could see the specific Clustering density, she associated with troops who had received their departure orders and were preparing to execute them rather than troops in holding position, based on her 6 days of notation. This configuration preceded movement by approximately 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days before the northern advance began, after which the eastern force would follow within 36 hours. She was not ready to go back. Cale delivered the message. He read it formally, because it was a formal document, and he was a formal aide doing his job correctly. The king requested her return to assist with border security assessment, specifically regarding the northern and eastern fronts, on the basis that her observational capacities exceeded the conventional intelligence network's current output. He finished reading and looked at her. She said, "Tell me something, Cale. The message describes my capacities as observational." Was that the king's language or the document writer's language? Cale said, after a moment's honest consideration, "The document writer's, I believe." She said, "And did the king give you any message beyond the document?" Cale said, "He asked me to tell you that the situation on the northern and eastern fronts is concerning, and that your perspective would be valued." She received the word valued with the specific attention of someone who had been thinking about the difference between need and value for 8 days and found the word's appearance in this context neither accidental nor sufficient. She said, "Tell the king that I am not available to assist the court's border security assessment." She said it calmly and completely, without the apologetic softening she had once applied to every statement that might cause inconvenience. Because 8 days on a mountain with the full sky open above her had clarified her relationship with apologetic softening, and she had decided it was not a habit she was resuming. Cale received the refusal with the specific composure of someone who had been briefed that refusal was possible and had prepared for it professionally. He said, "Is there any message you would like me to return to the king?" She thought for a moment. She said, "Tell him I hope the border assessment goes well." She said it without cruelty and without the pointed edge of deliberate irony. She meant it literally. She hoped the assessment went well, in the specific way that she hoped for the kingdom's people even when she had no obligation to hope for its governance. The two things were not the same thing, and she had stopped conflating them. Cale rested for 30 minutes as she had suggested, and then made his descent. She watched him go from the plateau's edge, and then turned back to the northeastern cluster, which had shifted another degree toward the movement configuration, while she was watching Cale drink his water. 3 to 5 days. She pressed both hands to the notation stone, and worked for 2 more hours, reading the full 5-sector picture with the methodical thoroughness she had applied every night since the blood moon. The western fourth movement had advanced slightly, still smaller than the others, still the most distant from execution, but no longer as tentative as it had appeared in the first night's reading. She completed the notation and sat with her back to the plateau's central rock and looked up at the full star map and thought about the eastern valleys. Not yet. She was not ready yet. She needed to understand the full shape of what was coming before she made the decision about what to do with it. She needed the picture to be complete. She needed the timing to be clear. She needed to choose the moment of return from her own certainty, rather than from his urgency. She needed, and she was honest with herself about this, to know that when she went back, she was going back for reasons that were hers rather than his. She pressed her palms to the cold stone, and watched the northeastern cluster settle into its new configuration, and began calculating, with the specific precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years, and was now doing it without apology, exactly how many days she had left before the calculation changed from her choice to the only possible action. The answer was approximately 5. She looked at the western sector. The fourth movement had an orientation she had not identified before tonight. It was not aimed directly at the western border. It was aimed at the western border's only river crossing. the crossing that the conventional intelligence network had classified as impassable at this time of year due to water levels. She stared at this for a long time. She said, "They know the water levels." She said, "Someone told them the water levels." Cale returned on the 11th day after the blood moon. He came directly to the study as instructed and delivered the refusal in full, her exact words, which he had memorized, and his own observations, which she had not asked for, but which he offered in the specific way of a perceptive aide who understood that context was part of his function. He said, "She is working. She has a notation system on Flatstone's 6 days of records when I arrived, possibly 8 by now. She is reading the sky." He said, "She did not seem distressed. She seemed occupied." Evander sat with this for a moment. He said, "Did she say anything else?" Cale said, "She said she hoped the border assessment went well." Evander looked at the window. The northern stars were visible in the early evening sky, the same stars Seraphine had been looking at for 11 nights now. Reading with the precision of an instrument he had spent 2 years sitting next to, without understanding what he was sitting next to. The second emissary, a senior military advisor, carrying a more urgent message, military language. Specific border intelligence requests was refused by written response delivered to the palace 3 days later, through a passing traveler Seraphine had apparently trusted with the note. The note said, "The court's border assessment is not a service I provide." It said nothing else. His war council met the following morning. Marin presented the consolidated intelligence picture. 3 borders showing coordinated pre-movement indicators. Timeline assessment suggesting simultaneous action within 2 to 3 weeks. The council was divided on the appropriate response. 2 generals favored preemptive border reinforcement. 2 deferred to the intelligence network's conventional assessment that the movements were ambiguous. Without better intelligence, the argument was circular. Hadron, at the council table's far end, said, "I want to formally note that the king's recent pursuit of intelligence from unofficial sources represents a potential security vulnerability." He said it in the administrative language he used for everything, smooth and procedural. He did not name Seraphine. He did not need to. Evander looked at him. He said to the council, "I will return in 4 days." He said it without explaining where he was going or why, which was itself the explanation, and every person at the table understood it. And Hadron's expression shifted through something he managed before it fully arrived. He left the next morning. He took no escort. This was both a security risk and a deliberate choice. The escort's presence would have reframed the journey as a royal summons, and he was not going to summon her. He was going to climb a mountain and stand in front of a woman he had failed and present himself, without the architecture of his position to hide behind. The escort would have been the architecture. The path was harder than he had imagined it would be, which was information about the character of what she had done on the night of the blood moon. Had chosen this path, in the dark, in ceremonial clothing, alone, with the blood moon's light behind her and nothing in front of her except the mountain and the stars. He climbed it in daylight with appropriate gear and found it demanding. He thought about her climbing it in the dark and understood something about her he had not previously had the specific physical reference point to understand. The altitude affected him in the way altitude affected people unaccustomed to it, a slight lightheadedness, a specific clarity of air that made the valley below seem more distant than the physical measurement suggested. He stopped at a wide point in the path and looked down at the palace, small and lit in the afternoon light, and then looked up at the sky above him, which was beginning to show the first stars of the evening in a way the valley sky did not yet. He understood, standing on the path with the altitude's cold arriving, why she had come here. The plateau appeared at the path's final turn wider than he had imagined, flat stone, the horizon open in all directions. The stars were fully visible here in a way that felt qualitatively different from any sky he had stood under. The atmosphere's thinning, producing a depth to the star field that made it feel dimensional rather than flat. She was at the plateau's center with both hands pressed to a flat stone, her face turned upward, entirely still in the way of someone who was receiving information through channels he did not have access to. She was wearing her own clothing, the practical, plain clothes she had always worn at court for her record work, not the ceremonial clothing of the blood moon night. She looked, from his first sight of her across the plateau's width, like someone who had been exactly where they were supposed to be for 11 nights and had stopped wondering whether that was acceptable. He crossed the plateau slowly, not because the distance required it, but because he understood, walking toward her, that his pace was the only element of the next few minutes he could control, and that controlling it carefully was the only courtesy available to him. She did not look up when he was 10 feet away. She did not look up when he was 5 feet away. She said, without moving her eyes from the sky, "The northeastern cluster shifted into movement configuration 40 minutes ago. The northern advance begins in 2 to 3 days." He stopped. She said, "I knew you were coming. The path announces footsteps an hour before they arrive if the wind is right." She withdrew her hands from the stone and looked at him. Her expression was not what he had prepared himself for. He had prepared for anger, for the cold formality of someone conducting a necessary transaction, for the contained grief of the blood moon night replayed at altitude. What he saw was something more difficult to receive than any of those: the specific, calm, unhurried regard of a woman who had spent 11 nights alone with the full sky open above her and had arrived at a state of self-possession so complete that his presence registered as information rather than event. She said, "Sit down if you want. The stone is cold, but it holds." He sat. She said, "I was not going to make this easy for you." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not going to make it easy for you." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Then say what you came to say. Correctly this time, not the military version." He said it correctly. She had not been certain he was capable of it, not because she had assessed him as incapable of honesty, but because the specific kind of honesty the moment required was the kind that did not soften itself for the speaker's comfort. And she had spent 2 years observing him choose comfort over the harder thing often enough that she had genuine uncertainty about whether he could stop. He said, "On the night of the blood moon, I knew what Hadron was going to do. He had told me his intention 3 days prior, not explicitly, but with sufficient clarity that I understood what the ceremony would contain." He said, "I did not prevent it." He said, "I told myself I was uncertain whether preventing it was my place, which was not true. I knew it was my place. I was not willing to pay the cost of occupying my place, which was naming what you are to me in front of the court on a night when the court would have required me to mean it permanently." She listened without expression. He said, "I chose the floor because looking at you would have required me to do something about what I saw. And I had been choosing not to do something about it for 2 years. And the ceremony was simply the moment when that choice produced a consequence I could not reverse." She said, "Why did you keep not doing something about it?" He said, "Because doing something about it would have required me to be certain. And I had been protecting my uncertainty, because certainty meant commitment, and commitment meant the possibility of being wrong in a way I could not take back. And I valued my own comfort more than I valued what the uncertainty was costing you." She looked at the northeastern cluster for a moment. The movement configuration was settled now. The cluster's density at the specific depth she associated with troops who had received final orders. 2 days, perhaps 3. She said, "Did you know at the blood moon what my not having formal standing meant for how the court treated me daily?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you allowed it to continue for 2 years because formalizing my standing would have required naming what I was to you?" He said, "Yes." She received this with the stillness she had been practicing on the mountain, not the stillness of someone suppressing a response, but the stillness of someone who had already processed the information and was now simply confirming that the processing had been accurate. She said, "I am going to ask you one more thing, and I need you to answer it correctly." He said, "Ask." She said, "When you decided to come here yourself instead of sending a third emissary, was that primarily because the kingdom needs my gift? Or primarily because you owe me something, and the military crisis gave you a reason to deliver it that looked like something other than what it was?" He was quiet for a long time. The mountain's cold moved through the plateau in the specific way of high-altitude wind, not aggressive. Simply present, the temperature of a place that did not adjust itself for human comfort. She waited. She was very good at waiting. He said both. He said, "I cannot separate them cleanly. The military situation is real, and the intelligence your gift provides is the difference between the kingdom surviving the next 3 weeks and not surviving them. That is not a performance of urgency, it is accurate." He said, "And I climbed this mountain without an escort and without a prepared speech because I needed to stand in front of you without the palace's architecture and say that I chose the floor, and I chose it knowing what it cost you. And the military crisis gave me a reason to do that, which also served my own interest in not having to come here purely on the basis of owing you something." She looked at him. She said, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 2 years." He said, "I know it is insufficient." She said, "Yes." She pressed both palms to the notation stone beside her and read the northeastern cluster, one more time, the movement configuration holding steady. The advance's final preparation complete in the pattern she had come to recognize across 11 nights of watching. She said, "I am going to tell you what I see. Not because you deserve it, and not because the military situation constitutes an adequate resolution of what you did." She said, "Because the people in the eastern valleys have not earned the consequence of your failure to stand up for me, and I cannot make them bear it." He said nothing. The correct response to this was silence, and he produced it. She said, "The northern advance is 2 to 3 days from movement. It is a two-pronged attack, 2 coordinated forces operating from different positions, which your conventional intelligence has not identified because it has been reading the northern border as a single front." She said, "The eastern force will move within 36 hours of the northern advance beginning." She said, "The southeastern campaign is a sustained operation with 3 months of supply infrastructure already in place." She said, "And there is a 4th movement on the western front that your intelligence has not detected at all, aimed at a river crossing your network considers impassable, which tells me someone with specific knowledge of your border's water levels has been providing information to the western force." He was very still. She said, "I will come back to the palace with you." She said it with the specific clarity of someone who had been clear about this decision since the moment she made it, and was delivering it as information rather than negotiation. She said, "I will work from the watchtower. I will deliver intelligence directly to whoever you designate to receive it. I will not attend court sessions. I will not receive instructions from Hadron." She said, "These are not requests." He said, "I understand." She said, "Good." She stood and began to gather her notation stones. She said, "We should descend before the path gets dark." She paused. She said, "I accept the account of what you did. I do not forgive it yet." He said, "I know." She said, "Stop saying I know and start demonstrating it." He stood and helped her pack the notation stones without being asked, carefully, in the order she indicated. And she watched him do this with the attention of someone taking the first data point in a new evidence base. It was a small thing. It was a start. The descent took longer than the ascent had. Not because the path was more difficult going down, though it was the loose stone less forgiving of a descending foot than a climbing one, but because she stopped twice to look at the sky from specific points on the path that she had identified during her 11 days of ascent and descent as offering particular clarity on certain sectors. The second stop was for the western cluster. which was low on the horizon here in a way it had not been from the plateau, and which showed her something in the fading light that she recorded in her smallest notation stone before continuing. Evander did not ask her to hurry. He followed at the distance she set and matched her pace at the stops and waited without performing patience. She noticed this and added it to the evidence base without comment. They reached the valley path by full dark and the palace by the early hours of the morning. Entering through the northern gate that connected to the administrative wing, rather than the main entrance that would have required passing through the court's occupied spaces. She had not asked him to choose this route. He had chosen it. She had her notation stones in her bag and 11 nights of recorded strategic intelligence and the specific quality of someone who had come down from a mountain by choice rather than by summons, which made the palace's familiar corridors feel different from how they had felt in 2 years of occupying them from the wrong category. The watchtower was on the palace's eastern wing, a functional military structure, not decorative. For stories of stone with an open platform at the top and a clear view of the northeastern, eastern, and southeastern sectors. She had looked at it from her small window for 2 years and had never been assigned to it or invited to it, because she had not been assigned to anything or invited to anything. She went directly to it. Evander unlocked it himself rather than summoning a guard, which she registered without acknowledgement. She climbed to the platform and looked at the sky, and the gift opened fully at the tower's height, not the plateau's altitude, but enough, sufficient for the working she needed to do. She was on the platform for 3 hours. She worked through the notation she had built on the mountain, translating the flat stone records into the palace's standard military cartography format, a larger, properly proportioned map that she laid out on the platform's map table using the materials she found stored there. The translation took the first hour. The reading took the second. She read all 4 moving fronts from the tower's height, confirming the configurations she had recorded and updating for the changes 12 hours of travel had produced. The third hour was documentation, producing the first formal intelligence report in the notation system's format. When she came down from the platform, Evander was sitting on the tower's ground floor with the specific quality of someone who had been there for 3 hours and had not left and had not announced that he had not left. She placed the intelligence report on the table between them. She said, "This is what I have been watching for 11 nights." He read it. He read it carefully, in the way he had read the notation stones on the mountain, not the skim of a king processing a summary, but the genuine attention of someone who was trying to understand the system rather than extract a conclusion from it. He asked questions, 3 of them specific and practical. What was the confidence level on the 2-pronged northern identification? How was the Eastern Force's 36-hour follow timeline derived? And what was the basis for the Western intelligence leak inference? She answered each one completely. The northern confidence level, high, based on 7 nights of consistent notation, showing 2 distinct clustering patterns that never merged into a single density, which was the star map signature of coordinated but spatially separated forces, rather than a single consolidated advance. The Eastern timing, derived from 5 nights of observation of the relationship between the Eastern cluster's stationary configuration and the Northern cluster's movement configuration. She had seen this relationship twice before in her life, once in her home province, once in the kingdom's southern sector 3 years before she arrived at court, and both times the Eastern force had moved within 30 to 40 hours of the Northern advance. The Western intelligence leak, the 4th movement's orientation toward the impassable river crossing, was impossible without specific local knowledge of current water levels, which were lower than the conventional seasonal average due to the previous summer's drought, a detail not in any publicly available record and known only through direct border assessment. Someone with access to that assessment had shared it. Evander looked at the report for a long time after she finished answering. He said, "How long have you been able to do this?" She said, "Since I was 8. She said it the way she said accurate things without apology or performance, simply the fact in its full form. He said, "And at court for 2 years?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You were watching this every night through your window?" She said, "The window showed me the northern and northeastern sectors. The eastern sector partially. I could not see the western front from the valley at all." He said, "And you said nothing?" She said, "I told you once. The northern consolidation, 3 weeks before it became significant. You looked at the stars and said they were very bright." He was quiet for a long time with this. She did not fill the silence for him. It was his to sit in. He said, "Finally, I would like to bring General Marin to the watchtower tomorrow morning. With your permission." She said, "Bring General Marin." She said, "Do not bring Hadron or anyone from his faction." He said, "Agreed." She said, "I need to sleep." She gathered the notation stones and the intelligence report and stood. He said, as she moved to the door, "The watchtower is yours. I will have it formally designated tomorrow." She stopped. She said, "I do not need it formally designated tonight. I need to sleep." She went. He sat in the tower's ground floor for a long time after she left, looking at the eastern window through which the northeastern cluster was visible, bright and dense in its movement configuration. 2 days from the advance, she had read from 11 nights of watching. He thought about the window in her small room on the eastern wing and what she had been watching. Through it for 2 years while he had been choosing the floor. He sat with this until the tower's cold became uncomfortable, and then he sat with it a little longer. General Marin arrived at the watchtower at dawn. She came alone, as Evander had specified, without the junior staff she normally brought to intelligence briefings. In the specific manner of someone who had been told that the situation required a quality of open attention that entourages made difficult. She was 62 years old. Direct in the way of people who had spent 4 decades being paid to be accurate rather than comfortable. And she looked at the intelligence report Seraphine placed in front of her with the focused absorption of someone reading a text in a language they recognized but had not encountered before in this specific form. She read it twice. She asked no questions during the first reading. During the second she asked 4, all of them precise and practical. None of them about Seraphine's methods or credibility. She was asking about the intelligence itself, which was the correct approach and which Seraphine noted as a data point about the person she was working with. When she finished the second reading, she set the report on the table and said, "The two-pronged northern identification changes the defensive architecture entirely. We have been planning for a single-front advance and positioning accordingly. If this is correct, our current positioning exposes the Northern Valley settlements to the second prong's approach with no buffer." Seraphine said, "Yes." Marin said, "And the eastern timing means we have a 72-hour window from the northern advance beginning to position an eastern response before the follow-up movement." Seraphine said, "Approximately. The eastern timing has a confidence range of 30 to 40 hours, not a precise figure. Plan for 30. Marin said, "The western leak is the most dangerous element. If someone with border assessment access has been providing intelligence to a foreign force, the security implications extend beyond this campaign." Seraphine said, "Yes. I have not been able to identify the source from the star map. I can tell you that the information shared was specific enough to require direct border assessment access. The list of people with that access should be small." Marin looked at her for a moment with the specific regard of someone revising an assessment they had not known they were making. She said, "How long have you been watching this?" Seraphine said, "The eastern and northern sectors for 6 weeks from the palace. All 4 fronts from altitude for 11 nights." Marin said, "You were in the palace 6 weeks ago." Seraphine said, "Yes." Marin looked at the window. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I would like to present this intelligence to the War Council this afternoon. Seraphine said, "The king will advise you on the council's composition for the session. I have specific concerns about certain council members' suitability for receiving intelligence from this source, which I have communicated to him." Marin said, "Hadron." Seraphine said, "And the two generals who have been deferring to his assessment of the border situation's ambiguity." Marin said, "Those are my two most senior generals after myself." Seraphine said, "Yes, I am aware of that." They looked at each other. Marin said, "The intelligence leak you identified, the source with border assessment access." Seraphine said, "I am not making that inference explicitly. I am noting that the Western force has specific knowledge that requires specific access, and that the council members who have most consistently argued against taking the border threat seriously are in a position to have provided that access. I am not a military investigator. I am telling you what the stars show me, and you may draw your own conclusions." Marin said, "I have already drawn them." The War Council session that afternoon was where the difficulty arrived in its full institutional form. Evander had convened it as a restricted session. Marin, two junior generals whose records Seraphine had reviewed through the palace archives and found clean, Evander's personal military secretary, and himself. Hadron arrived at the chamber door with his two allied generals and was informed the session was restricted. He accepted this with the smooth composure of someone who had anticipated the maneuver and was already planning its counter. The counter arrived the following morning. Hadron submitted a formal council motion, the specific procedural instrument that required a response, within 24 hours, challenging the restricted session's legitimacy on the basis that intelligence affecting the kingdom's full border security required full War Council review. The motion named, without using her name, the source of the restricted session's intelligence, an unbonded individual of unofficial court standing whose methods had not been subjected to the council's standard verification protocols. The motion was technically correct in every particular. Intelligence sources were subject to verification protocols. An unbonded individual without formal standing was outside the established framework. The motion was a procedurally impeccable challenge to everything she was doing, assembled with the specific precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this situation since the moment Evander returned from the mountain with her in his company. Seraphine read the motion in the watchtower that afternoon with the contained attention she brought to everything that required accurate assessment. She said nothing. She went back to her notation. That evening, General Marin came to the watchtower with a dispatch from the northern border runner. Unusual movement, northern eastern quadrant, two distinct force formations observed simultaneously. The conventional intelligence had just confirmed the two-pronged formation. She had identified 11 days earlier from the stars above her mountain plateau. Marin placed the dispatch beside the intelligence report. She said, "This confirms your two-pronged identification, 2 days ahead of your timeline estimate." Seraphine looked at the dispatch and then at the northeastern cluster, currently reading in the final pre-movement configuration denser than last night, the advance imminent rather than approaching. She said, "They are moving tonight." Marin said, "Tonight." Seraphine said, "The eastern force will follow within 30 hours. We have less time than the motion's 24-hour response window." Marin said, "I will inform the king." She was at the door when Seraphine said, "The motion is Hadron's move to control who receives this intelligence. If he obtains the verification review he is requesting, the review process will take longer than the Eastern Front has. He knows this." Marin stopped. She turned. She said, "Yes." Seraphine said, "The king needs to decide tonight whether he is going to let a procedural motion determine the kingdom's military response to an invasion that is currently in motion." The dispatch sat on the table between the intelligence report and the notation stones, outside the watchtower's eastern window. The northeastern star cluster was moving the specific restless shift of a configuration that had been building for weeks and had finally, irrevocably, committed to its direction. Marin left at a run. Seraphine turned back to the sky and read the eastern cluster's response to the northern movement already beginning to accelerate from its stationary configuration. The follow-up force activating on the timeline she had predicted. She pressed both hands to the cold stone rail and watched the invasion begin in the stars above her, and began preparing the real-time intelligence that would determine whether the kingdom's defenders were in the right positions when it arrived on the ground. The northern advance moved at midnight. She read it in the stars in real time, the northeastern cluster's final configuration shift. The specific rapid density change she had been waiting for. The two prongs separating in the sky map as they separated on the ground, each moving toward its designated objective in the coordinated pattern she had been tracking for weeks. She documented it as it happened, the notation stones recording the movement's pace and direction with the precision of an instrument calibrated to exactly this. She sent the documentation to Marin by midnight runner. Marin had already begun repositioning the northern defenses based on the previous day's intelligence, not the full repositioning the two-pronged identification required, which would have needed council authorization. But the preliminary adjustments within a general's direct authority that bought the kingdom the critical margin between adequate response and catastrophic exposure. Seraphine read this in the stars, as well the specific way that a defender's movement appeared in the sky map as a counter-clustering against the advancing force's density. The eastern cluster began its acceleration at the 14-hour mark. She had predicted 30. It came at 14. She stared at this for a moment with the specific attention of someone whose instrument had just produced a reading outside its expected range. The eastern cluster's movement pattern was accelerating faster than any of her previous observations. A follow-up force behavior had suggested was possible. Either her timing model had a flaw, or the eastern force had received updated orders earlier coordination with the northern advance than the original plan had specified. She documented it and sent the update and turned back to the sky. The southeastern cluster was holding the supply-heavy campaign that she had assessed as the slowest and most sustained of the four threats was maintaining its pre-movement configuration, which was consistent with a force designed for sustained siege rather than rapid advance. It would move when it moved, and what mattered was that the kingdom had sufficient warning to address the more acute northern and eastern situations before the southeastern campaign reached its engagement point. The western cluster was the one she kept returning to. It had advanced further in the past 24 hours than in the previous 6 days combined. The river crossing objective was now clearly visible in the star map, the fourth force's orientation, locked on the specific point she had identified. Its movement deliberate and unhurried in the way of a force that believed it would not be opposed at its crossing point. The confidence of the western movement troubled her more than the urgency of the eastern. Urgency suggested response. Confidence suggested certainty. Someone had told them they would not be opposed. She pressed both hands to the stone rail and read the western cluster with the full depth the tower's height allowed, trying to extract additional detail from the configuration, the specific quality of the force's coordination, any indication of how far out from crossing it currently was. The crossing was 3 days out, possibly 4. The kingdom had no defenses positioned for the western front, because the kingdom believed the western crossing was impassable. Evander appeared at the watchtower's upper platform doorway at the 3rd hour of the morning. He had not been to sleep. She could read this in the quality of his alertness. The specific sustained attention of someone running on urgency rather than rest. He carried Marin's most recent dispatch. He said, "The northern repositioning is holding. The two-pronged advance is meeting the adjusted defense line." He said, "The eastern acceleration is the current critical situation. Marin is requesting your real-time reading for the next 6 hours. She said, I am already providing it. He said, the War Council's restricted session reconvenes at dawn. Hadron's motion has been tabled pending the active military situation, which gives us approximately 72 hours before the procedural challenge resumes. She said, 72 hours is longer than the Eastern Front has. He said, I know. She said, when the Eastern situation is resolved, Hadron will use the resolution as evidence that the crisis is over and the verification review should proceed. He will argue that any intelligence provided during the crisis period was unverified and should not form the basis of ongoing military decisions. Evander said, he will not succeed in that argument. She said, he will succeed if the Council's composition allows him to. She said, the Western Front gives him 4 days. He will have the verification review in motion before the Western Crossing becomes the active crisis. Evander said, what do you recommend? She said, I recommend addressing the Western Front's intelligence leak first. She said, if the source of the leak is on the War Council, the Council cannot be trusted with the Western Front intelligence regardless of the verification review's outcome. She said, find the source before you share the Western intelligence with anyone beyond Marin. He said, how? She said, the water level assessment that was shared, who conducted it, who received it, who had access to the report. She said, the drought that produced the anomalous water levels was documented last autumn. The border assessment would have been conducted in early spring. The report chain is 6 months old. It is not recent intelligence. It was collected and held and used at a specific moment when it became operationally relevant. He said, someone has been planning this for at least 6 months. She said, at least. He looked at the Western cluster through the platforms railing the low horizon stars that she had shown him the notation for, the fourth movement steady. Confident advance toward a crossing it had been promised would be unguarded. He said, I need to address this tonight. She said, yes. She said, go. She was already turning back to the Eastern cluster, which had moved further in the past hour than her documentation had been able to fully capture. He said from the doorway, I will have the motion formally withdrawn by morning. She said, without turning, withdrawing Hadron's motion is a temporary solution. The underlying question, who receives this intelligence and under what authority, needs a permanent answer before the Western crisis arrives. She said, that permanent answer is what I am going to require before I am willing to say I am staying. She heard him go down the stairs and turned fully to the Eastern cluster and pressed both hands to the cold stone rail and read the acceleration pattern with everything the gift could give her at the tower's height, and began building the real-time intelligence picture that the Eastern Front's defenders needed in the next 6 hours. The stars showed her everything. She showed it to the people who needed it. That was enough for tonight. The Eastern Front held. Not cleanly, not without cost, war never resolved cleanly. And Seraphine had been reading enough star maps long enough to understand that the difference between a successful defense and a catastrophic one was measured in the specific margins that good intelligence produced, not in the elimination of all damage. The Eastern Front held in the specific way that adequate warning enabled. The defenders were in the right positions when the follow-up force arrived at the 14-hour mark. And the 14-hour acceleration rather than the predicted 30 had been costly in the preparatory margin, but not fatal because Marin had been repositioning since midnight, and the 7 hours of preparation she had were sufficient for a competent general to make use of. Marin was a competent general. The northern two-pronged advance was engaged and slowed by the repositioned defenses. Not stopped a sustained engagement rather than a decisive early resolution, but contained in the specific way that buying time enabled. The kingdom had time. Not unlimited time, but enough. On the morning of the third day, Evander presented Seraphine with the water level assessment's distribution record. He had spent 2 nights running it down through the administrative chain, who had conducted the assessment, who had signed the report, who had received copies. The assessment had been conducted by a border surveying team in early spring. The report had been distributed to 9 individuals, 5 border administrators, 3 war council members, and the palace's chief strategic advisor. The chief strategic advisor was Lord Hadron. She read the distribution list twice. She looked at the notation stone that recorded the Western Cluster's confident, unhurried advance toward a river crossing it had been promised was unguarded. She put the 2 things together in the specific way she put all accurate information together plainly, without dramatizing what did not require drama. She said, "He needs to be removed from the council before the Western intelligence is shared with anyone." Evander said, "Yes." She said, "Today." He said, "Today." She did not ask how. The how was his function in the governance structure, and she had been clear since the mountain about the division of function between them. She read the sky. He managed the court. The Western Front had 3 days, possibly 4. 3 days was enough for a king to act if the king was prepared to act decisively, which Evander had been demonstrating, in small specific ways, that he was becoming. The watchtower had been formally designated as the Star Navigator's intelligence station on the 2nd day after their return. Not announced to the full court, there had been no public ceremony, no formal presentation. It had been entered into the palace's administrative record by the military secretary and acknowledged in the restricted War Council session as the source of current border intelligence. This was the minimum viable formal recognition, and Seraphine had accepted it as the minimum viable formal recognition rather than as the resolution of the larger question. Because the larger question required the public context of the confrontation she knew was coming. The formal designation had one practical effect she cared about. She was no longer accessing the watchtower by Evander's personal authorization. She was there by institutional designation, which could not be revoked by Lord Hadron's procedural motion or by anyone else's administrative action without going through the formal record amendment process that required the king's signature. She had learned, in 2 years of meticulous court record work, exactly which institutional mechanisms were revocable and which were not. She had been specific about which mechanism she wanted used for the designation. General Marin visited the watchtower every morning now. They had developed a working rhythm in 3 days that had the specific efficiency of 2 people whose tools complemented each other and who had recognized this immediately. Seraphine provided the strategic picture. Marin translated it into operational decisions. The translation worked because Marin asked the right questions and received the answers without the distorting layer of disbelief that had made the gift silent for 20 years. The gift at the tower's working height, not the plateau's full altitude. But the palace's highest structure was sufficient for the forefront picture. Not the depth of the mountain reading, but enough. She managed the sufficiency by working methodically rather than at the gift's maximum range. Reading each sector in sequence rather than simultaneously. Building a composite picture across 2 hours of work each night, rather than the instantaneous full sky awareness the plateau had provided. She was on the 3rd night's reading when the Western Cluster showed her something that stopped her mid-notation. The Western force had reached the river crossing. Not 3 days. Not 4. 2 days ahead of her most aggressive estimate, the confident, unhurried advance had become a rapid final approach. The clustering density shifting from organized movement to the specific configuration she associated with imminent action. The Western force was at the crossing tonight. She sent for Marin immediately. Marin arrived in 12 minutes. Seraphine showed her the Western Cluster's current configuration without preamble, pointing at the specific density shift and the orientation of the force toward the crossing point. She said, "They are crossing tonight. The impassable river is not impassable. I need the Western defensive infrastructure activated in the next 4 hours. Marin looked at the cluster's configuration and said, "We have nothing on the Western Front. The standing assumption has been that no defensive positioning is required there." Seraphine said, "I know." She said, "This is the consequence of someone providing the Western force with information about the water levels." She said, "We have 4 hours before they are across." Marin said, 4 hours is not enough to move defensive forces from their current positions." Seraphine said, "Then what can you move in 4 hours?" Marin said, "The Northern Contingency Unit. They are the closest available force with sufficient mobility." She said, "It will not be sufficient for a full defensive engagement, but it will be sufficient to contest the crossing rather than concede it." Seraphine said, "Contest the crossing. By time for the full defensive response." Marin said, "Yes." She was already moving. Seraphine turned back to the Western cluster and read it again, full depth, both hands on the stone, the gift at the tower's maximum useful range. The crossing force was larger than the star map's distance had allowed her to fully assess. She had been reading the Western Fourth Movement as a significant but secondary threat. What she was reading now, at this proximity, was a primary force, not a flanking action, a full invasion commitment. The Western Crossing was not a secondary element of the multi-front campaign. It was the campaign's primary objective. Everything else had been designed to draw the kingdom's defensive attention to 3 borders while the real advance came through the one border everyone believed was impassable. She held this understanding for exactly the time it required, and then she said, aloud, "To the empty watchtower platform, the Western Front is the main effort." She sent a second runner to Marin with 7 words. "Western Crossing is primary objective, not secondary." Then she pressed both hands back to the stone and began the most sustained reading she had ever attempted, all 4 fronts simultaneously, holding them all in the gift's perception at once. The real-time strategic picture of a 4-front invasion in the specific moment when the strategy's full shape had become visible. It cost her. She felt it in the gift's specific cost register, the deep, pulling exhaustion that sustained multi-front reading produced, the warmth leaving her hands, the cold moving in. She held it open anyway. The kingdom needed the full picture. She had come down from the mountain for exactly this. She held it open and read and documented and sent notation after notation down the watchtower stairs, with the runner who had been stationed there, and she did not stop until the Western Crossings. Real-time movement was fully documented and in Marin's hands. Then she sat down on the platform floor with her back against the stone rail and the stars above her, and the cold arriving in earnest, and said nothing for a long time. She heard Evander come up the stairs. She did not turn. He sat on the platform floor beside her without being asked and said nothing and did not leave. The Western Front engagement lasted 6 days. Seraphine read it from the watchtower every night. The Northern Contingency Unit had reached the river crossing with 40 minutes to spare, not enough for a full defensive positioning, but enough for the specific disruption that Marin had called contesting the crossing rather than conceding it. The Western force had expected to cross an unguarded river and had instead encountered organized resistance at a point it had been told would be empty. The confidence that had characterized its advance for 11 days became, in the star map's color register, the specific orange-red of a force that had received contradictory information and was recalculating. Recalculation cost time. Time allowed the kingdom's defensive infrastructure to respond. Over 6 days, Seraphine provided real-time intelligence on all 4 fronts to Marin's operational planning team. The sessions had a specific rhythm. She read for 2 hours at the tower's height, producing a detailed notation of all 4 configurations. The notation was translated by Marin's team into operational decisions. The decisions were implemented. The consequences appeared in the star map approximately 12 to 18 hours later as configuration responses. She was watching the strategy of the full campaign in near real time. the forefront picture updating each night with the previous day's ground decisions encoded in the stars above the relevant territory. The southeastern campaign, the supply-heavy, sustained operation she had assessed as the slowest threat, began its advance on the fourth day of the Western engagement. Its advance was methodical and unsurprised by the kingdom's response, which suggested its commanders had planned for the other three fronts' disruption and were operating on a timeline that assumed the Western crossing would not succeed as planned. The southeastern campaign was designed to outlast the crisis rather than to create it. Seraphine watched it begin its advance and updated her assessment. The southeastern front would require a sustained response over weeks rather than the acute crisis management the other three fronts had required. She told Marin. Marin adjusted the planning framework accordingly. By the sixth day, the Western crossing had been contained. The force was across but stalled. Its supply lines disrupted by the defensive response's follow-up operations. Its advance into the kingdom's interior slower than its planners had anticipated. The northern two-pronged advance had been further slowed by Marin's repositioned defenses. The eastern follow-up force had been engaged and was sustaining significant attrition from the positions Seraphine's 14-hour early warning had allowed the defenders to occupy. The campaign was not over. It would not be over for weeks, and the southeastern front would require sustained attention into the winter. But the acute danger, the moment in which simultaneous forefront invasion could overwhelm the kingdom's response capacity, had passed. The kingdom had time. Real time. The kind of time that allowed proper military decisions rather than emergency reactions. On the sixth night, Seraphine read all four fronts in the session that she had been building toward since the Western configuration had revealed itself as the campaign's primary effort. The full four-front simultaneous read, not the sequential sector-by-sector approach she had been using at the tower's height, but the simultaneous full-sky awareness she had accessed on the mountain plateau, achieved by working at the absolute edge of what the tower's altitude allowed and pushing the gift to its maximum sustainable depth. It was the most demanding thing she had done since the plateau's first full reading on the blood moon night. She held all four fronts open in her perception for 90 minutes, the northern engagement's current state, the eastern force's attrition pattern, the southeastern advance's methodical progress, the western force's disrupted supply situation. She read the complete strategic architecture of a four-front campaign in near real time and translated it into the most comprehensive operational intelligence document the Watchtower had produced in 6 days of working. She finished the documentation at the second hour of the morning and sat down on the platform floor with the gift's cost arriving in full. The exhaustion was not dramatic. She had described it to Evander on the mountain as the specific cost of carrying the weight of a continent's strategic reality in her perception. And that was accurate, a deep, pulling depletion that was not dangerous but was insistent, that required the specific response of warmth and rest, and the 24 hours of recovery the gift needed after sustained multi-front work before it would operate at full capacity again. She had been managing this cost carefully across 6 days of nightly sessions, spacing the intensive readings against lighter monitoring work in the intervening hours, eating and resting on the schedule she had developed from 20 years of understanding her own limits. She had not exceeded those limits. Tonight she had approached them. She sat with her back against the stone rail and the stars above her and her hands in her lap, pale with the cold that always followed sustained altitude reading, and she allowed herself the specific stillness of someone who had done what needed doing and was now simply present in the aftermath. She heard Evander on the stairs before he reached the platform. She heard the change in his step at the last turn, the pause that told her he had assessed the situation from the stairway opening before entering, which was a habit she had watched him develop over 6 nights of Watchtower visits. He was learning to approach her working space with the specific courtesy of someone who understood that what happened on this platform was not his to direct or interrupt. He came through the opening and sat beside her on the platform floor without speaking. He had brought 2 cups of something warm, the kitchen's late-night preparation, which he had apparently arranged without announcing he was doing so. He placed one beside her and held the other and said nothing. She looked at the cup. She said, "You have been bringing the kitchen's preparation every night since the 4th day." He said, "Yes." She said, "I did not notice until tonight." He said, "You were working." She picked up the cup. It was warm through the pottery against her cold hands, the gift's depletion having taken the surface warmth from her skin in the way it always did. She held it and did not drink it immediately, simply allowing the warmth to transmit. She said, "The Western Front is the primary effort. The other 3 fronts were designed to draw the defensive response, while the real advance came through the impassable crossing." She said, "Whoever provided the water-level intelligence understood this strategy. They did not provide the information opportunistically. They provided it as part of the strategy's design." He said, "Hadron was formally removed from the War Council this morning. The distribution list and the timing of the water-level report's provision were entered into the Security Investigations record." He said, "He is under house confinement pending the full investigation." She said, "Good." He said, "The investigation will take time." She said, "Investigations do." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The campaign brief I received from Marin tonight included a strategic assessment section that attributed the campaign's contained outcome to the intelligence advantage provided by the Watchtower's star navigation function. It named the function. It did not name you." She said, "Did you ask Marin to name me?" He said, "I did not need to ask. The brief's next revision will." She looked at the stars above the Watchtower's open platform. The 4 clusters were settling into their post-engagement configurations, the specific quality of star patterns above active military situations that had passed their critical moments and entered the sustained phase. She read this settling with the passive, unfocused quality of a gift operating below its active threshold, the way peripheral vision registered motion without deliberate looking. She said, "I am going to sleep for most of tomorrow. The gift needs 24 hours after a session like tonight before it operates at full capacity." He said, "I know." He said, "I will manage the morning's briefings from the previous notation." He said, "You do not need to be available tomorrow." She looked at him. She said, "You know my recovery requirements." He said, "I have been paying attention." She received this as the specific evidence. It was not the performed attention of someone demonstrating consideration, but the functional attention of someone who had been watching how she worked and had built an accurate model of what she needed. She added it to the evidence base. She said, "The public confrontation with what Hadron's faction did on the Blood Moon night cannot wait until the campaign is fully resolved. The campaign will continue for weeks. The confrontation needs to happen before it becomes a permanent deferral." He said, "I know." She said, "I am going to require it to happen this week." He said, "I know that too." She finished the warm drink and set the cup down on the platform floor beside the notation stones, and looked at the settled star configurations one more time with the passive gift reading that required nothing from her exhausted body. The sky above the kingdom was quieter tonight than it had been in 6 days. Not peaceful 4 active military fronts did not produce peace in the star map, but quieter, the specific quality of a situation that had been through its acute phase and had arrived at the sustained phase, which was less immediately dangerous and harder in its own way, because sustained situations required endurance rather than crisis management, and endurance required reserves that crisis adrenaline had spent. She had reserves. She had been building them carefully for 20 years. She was still here. That was what mattered tonight. The War Council session was on the 7th day. Not the restricted session, the full council, reconvened with its complete membership, minus Hadron, who was under house confinement, and minus his two allied generals, who had been placed on administrative review pending the security investigation's completion. What remained was a council that had been restructured by the past week's events into something more functional than what it had been, with the specific clarity that a crisis produced in institutional bodies when the crisis was sufficient to override the ordinary political calculations that muddied decision-making in quieter times. Seraphine attended. This was her choice. She had not been asked to attend, she had been asked to provide the notation update for the morning's briefing, which she had provided. And the question of whether she would remain for the council session had not been raised by anyone, because no one had known what to expect from her on that point, including Evander, who had been careful not to ask her to do anything she had not already decided to do. She sat at the council table in the position that Marin had indicated when she entered, which was Marin's right side, not the foot of the table, not the peripheral observer's position, but a working seat at the table's functional center, which was where the intelligence function belonged, and which Marin had placed her in with the specific deliberateness of a general establishing a fact through positioning rather than argument. She was wearing the same plain, practical clothing she had worn on the mountain and in the watchtower. She had not made adjustments for the council chamber's formality. She was not going to perform a presentation of herself for the council's benefit. She was the person who had read for simultaneous invasion fronts from a mountain plateau and a palace watchtower for 17 nights. And the council could adapt its assessment of appropriate attire to that reality, rather than the other way around. The session proceeded through the military briefing. Marin presented the campaign's current status, the forefront situation, the strategic assessment that attributed the contained outcome to the intelligence advantage the watchtower had produced. She named the function. Then she said, "The strategic assessment's attribution requires the council's formal acknowledgement of the intelligence source, which has not yet been entered into the official record." She said Seraphine's name. She said her title, Star Navigator, as it had been entered into the palace's administrative designation 3 days prior. She said the title with the specific neutrality of someone presenting a fact rather than making an argument, which was exactly what she was doing. Two of the remaining council members, the ones whose records Seraphine had reviewed before agreeing to work with them, received this without visible reaction, which was the appropriate response to information being formally entered into the record. The third looked at the table in the specific way that people who had been told what to think by a removed colleague looked at things when the colleague was no longer there to tell them. Evander spoke. He said, "I want to address something this council has not formally discussed, but which is relevant to the record's completeness." He said it with the steady quality he had when he had decided something and was not recalibrating mid-delivery. He said, 17 days ago, on the night of the blood moon ceremony, this court conducted a public accounting of an individual's standing status that was orchestrated to cause that individual harm. He said, "I was present. I did not intervene." He said, "The individual was Seraphine, who is sitting at this table as the Star Navigator, and who has spent the past 6 days providing the intelligence that has allowed this kingdom to contain a forefront invasion." He said, "The record of the blood moon ceremony and the record of the past 6 days' intelligence work belong in the same document, because they describe the same person and what this court did with her, and what she did regardless of what this court did with her." The chamber was quiet. He said, "I am formally apologizing to the Star Navigator in front of this council on behalf of the court whose conduct I permitted." He said, "I am also formally apologizing for my own silence, which permitted what happened and which I could have prevented." He said, "Both apologies are on the official record as of this session." Seraphine looked at the council table's surface. Not down, she was not managing her eyes for anyone's comfort anymore. And looking at the table was not avoidance, but the specific stillness of someone receiving something in public that they had been asked for in private, and are confirming that the public delivery matches the private account. It matched. She looked up. She said, "The record of the blood moon ceremony also contains Lord Hadron's orchestration of the public shaming, which is now additionally relevant to the security investigation, as the same individual was providing military intelligence to a foreign force." She said, "I want the connection between the blood moon ceremony and the security investigation to be explicit in the official record, because I do not believe the shaming was unrelated to the suppression of intelligence capabilities that would have been inconvenient for the campaign's success." The chamber was very quiet. The military secretary's pen moved. She said, "I am not asking this council for recognition of my worth. My worth is in the notation." She placed the 7 days of Watchtower notation stones on the council table in their sector order. She said, "These are 17 nights of star map intelligence covering 4 invasion fronts. They are the official record of what the Star Navigator function produces." She said, "I want them entered into the permanent military record as the primary documentation of this campaign's intelligence basis, not as a supplement to the conventional intelligence network's record, as the primary document." Marin said, seconded. The motion passed. Seraphine gathered the notation stones back into her bag. The originals were staying with her, and copies would be made for the permanent record by the military secretary's office. She stood to leave when one of the council members who had been looking at the table said, carefully, in the specific tone of someone choosing to speak rather than remaining in the position his removed colleague's influence had placed him, "The Star Navigator's designation, is it permanent or provisional?" She said, "That is a question for the King's administrative record." She looked at Evander. He said, "Permanent." She left the chamber with the notation stones in her bag and the council session's official record containing her name and her title and the account of what had been done to her and what she had done regardless. And she walked through the palace corridors to the watchtower and climbed to the platform and pressed both hands to the stone rail and read the afternoon sky with the passive gift reading of someone whose recovery period was still in progress, but whose instrument was present and functioning. The 4 fronts were in their sustained configurations. The sky was quiet in the way of a situation that had passed its acute phase and required endurance rather than crisis response. She was still here. She had not been shamed twice. The private conversation happened the evening after the council session in the watchtower, which had become the location of every significant exchange between them since the mountain, not because she had designated it as such, but because it was the space where she was most fully herself, where the gift operated and the notation stones were, and the sky was visible, and everything she was had a natural context. And he had understood without being told that coming to her in this space was different from asking her to come to him. He arrived at the usual time, the hour when the day's administrative work had concluded and the night's reading had not yet begun, the specific window between. She was reviewing the previous night's notation against the military secretary's campaign record when he came up the stairs. Cross-referencing her star map documentation against the conventional intelligence network's ground reports in the systematic way she had begun doing 3 days ago to build the comparative record that demonstrated the 2 systems' respective accuracies. He sat. She continued the cross-reference for the remaining 2 entries and completed it and set it aside. She looked at him. She said, "There are 3 things I require before I will formally confirm that I am staying." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The first is structural. The Star Navigator designation needs to be formalized as a permanent court role with specific constitutional protections, not an administrative designation that can be revoked by a council motion or by the King's change of preference." She said, "The blood moon ceremony demonstrated what happens to people in this court whose standing depends on another person's willingness to protect it in the moment." She said, "I will not have standing that depends on your willingness to speak. I will have standing that exists regardless of whether you speak." He said, The court charter can be amended to include the Star Navigator as a constitutional role. The amendment process requires council ratification, which will take 3 weeks. He said, I will begin it tomorrow. She said, the second is procedural. The blood moon ceremony's standing accounting must be amended. No individual's court standing may be publicly processed for record purposes without their prior written consent. She said, what Hadron did was procedurally impeccable under the current ceremonial protocols. The protocol itself is the problem. She said, it creates a mechanism by which any person in an ambiguous court position can be publicly diminished through administrative procedure, with the court's formal authority lending weight to the act. She said, I want the mechanism removed. He said, the ceremony's protocols are within my direct administrative authority to amend. I can do it by decree rather than council ratification. He said, I will do it this week. She said, the third is personal. She was quiet for a moment, assembling the words for the thing that was hardest to say because it was the most necessary. She said, when you chose the floor on the blood moon night, the thing you were choosing against was naming what I was to you. She said, I am not asking you to name it in the same moment, in the same public context, with the same irreversibility the blood moon ceremony created. She said, I am asking you to understand that I am not going to stay in a situation where the naming of what I am to you is perpetually deferred because deferral is comfortable. She said, I have a constitutional role now and permanent standing, and I can stay in this court for the rest of my life without requiring your acknowledgement of anything personal between us. She said, but I will not participate in the version of this where you feel things and don't name them, and I spend another 2 years waiting. He said, I will not ask you to wait. She said, that is not the same as naming it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I failed to name it for 2 years because I was protecting my uncertainty. I told you this on the mountain. He said, the protection of my uncertainty was the protection of my comfort at the cost of yours, which I also told you on the mountain. He said, I am not uncertain anymore. He said, I have not been uncertain since the blood moon night. When watching you leave the gallery, resolved the uncertainty by demonstrating its cost. She said, and what is the thing you are no longer uncertain about? He said, that you are the most important person in my life, and that I have been aware of this for approximately 2 years, and have been declining to act on it, because acting on it required commitment, and commitment required the public version of what I felt for you. And the public version was what I was not prepared to provide. He said, I am prepared to provide it now. He said, I would like to. She looked at him with the same direct, unmanaged regard she had brought to everything since the blood moon night, the full quality of attention she had stopped filtering. The assessment that did not soften itself for the assessed person's comfort. She said, the council session's apology today. He said, yes. She said, the watchtower designation. He said, yes. She said, every night on the stairs before you came onto the platform. He said, yes. She said, the kitchen preparation every night since the 4th day. He said, yes. She said, you have been demonstrating rather than declaring. He said, I was trying to build the evidence base before presenting the conclusion. He said it with the specific quality she recognized as honest self-awareness rather than calculated strategy, a man who had understood, from watching how she worked, that she required evidence rather than assertion, and who had been providing it in the way he was able to provide it. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, I am going to tell you something I have not told you before. He waited. She said, on the second night on the mountain, I read your fate thread in the stars above the valley. Not deliberately, the gift does not usually produce personal readings. It reads strategic architecture rather than individual conditions. But your situation and the kingdom's situation were sufficiently entangled that the personal and strategic were producing the same configuration. She said, The reading showed me a person who was going to climb a mountain alone, without an escort and without a prepared speech, to stand in front of someone he had failed. She said, "I saw this on the second night." She said, "I stayed on the mountain because the reading showed me you were coming, and I needed to know that you came without being summoned." He said after a moment, and she said, "You came without being summoned." She said, "That was what I required. Not the apology, though the apology was necessary. Not the constitutional role, though that is also necessary. What I required was to know that you were capable of choosing the harder thing when the harder thing was what the situation required." He said, "I climbed a mountain alone." She said, "Yes." She said, "That is the beginning of sufficient evidence." He said, "What would constitute sufficient evidence overall?" She said, "I will tell you when I have enough." He said, "I can work with that." She said, "Good." She reached for the night's first notation stone. She said, "The southeastern front is entering its third movement phase. I need to read it before the window closes." He said, "I will stay." She said, "I know." She turned to the sky and pressed her hands to the stone rail, and the gift opened into the night above the watchtower, and she read what it showed her. And he sat behind her on the platform floor, and was present without being in the way, which was the specific quality of presence the watchtower required. And she worked until the window closed, and then she came away from the railing, and they sat together in the cold platform air with the notation stones between them, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence was the specific full silence of two people who had stopped managing the distance between them. The charter amendment passed in 3 weeks, as Evander had projected. The Star Navigator was formally constituted as a permanent court role with specific protections enumerated in the kingdom's foundational administrative charter. The role could not be dissolved by council motion, could not be suspended by administrative review, could not be made conditional on the holder's personal relationship with any court member. It existed independently, was funded independently, and reported to the War Council directly rather than through any intermediate authority. The language had been drafted by Seraphine. She had spent 3 evenings on it, in the watchtower. With the specific precision she brought to record-keeping that mattered, the precision that understood language was not decoration, but the architecture of what was possible. She had written the protections to address every mechanism Hadron's blood moon shaming had exploited, and several mechanisms it had not exploited, but theoretically could have. When she presented the draft to Evander, he had read it once and said, "There is nothing to revise." He had submitted it to the council ratification process unaltered. 2 junior aides had been assigned to the watchtower in the 4th week of the campaign's sustained phase. She had selected them herself from the court's administrative staff, one with a strong spatial memory for notation, one with a background in cartographic representation that allowed him to translate her star map notation into the conventional map format the military used for operational planning. She trained them in the notation system with the thorough, patient method of someone who had developed a discipline over 20 years and was transmitting it for the first time to people who wanted to learn it. The training took 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, she had 2 aides who could maintain the notation during the hours she was not working, and who could produce readable operational briefs from the notation's raw form without her direct translation. She had built a function that did not depend entirely on her single continuous presence, which was what a function needed to be if it was going to outlast any individual. She thought about this, about building things to outlast the builder, more than she spoke about it. It was connected to the founding era texts she had read in the Vedris archive, which she thought about sometimes with the specific private recognition of a person who has found something that resonates in a register she did not know she had. The campaign's sustained phase lasted 8 weeks. The southeastern front was the final resolution, the supply-heavy, methodical campaign she had assessed from the beginning as the longest and most enduring of the 4 threats. She tracked it nightly, providing the operational intelligence that allowed Marin to respond to each phase of its advance, rather than waiting for each development to become a crisis before addressing it. By the 6th week, it was clear that the Southeastern Campaign's commanders had not planned for the kingdom's intelligence advantage, had planned for the conventional situation, the blind kingdom. The court that did not know what was coming, and the planning failure, was compounding in the specific way that strategic failures compounded when the assumptions underlying the strategy proved wrong. The Southeastern Campaign ended not in a decisive engagement, but in a withdrawal the specific. Withdrawal of forces whose strategic situation had deteriorated beyond the point where continued advance was rational. The star map showed it as a gradual declustering of the southeastern sector, the density dispersing over 3 nights from the invasion configuration back toward something that would eventually read as ordinary border patrol activity. She watched the declustering with both hands on the stone rail and said, to the notation aide who was working beside her, "The southeastern front is concluding." She said it with the practical tone she used for reporting accurately, without the specific drama of a moment that felt, in some internal register she did not display, like something significant. 8 weeks of sustained military activity for simultaneous fronts, 17 nights of mountain reading, and 56 nights of watchtower reading. The campaign was over. General Marin presented the campaign's final assessment to the full War Council 3 days after the southeastern withdrawal. The assessment was the most comprehensive military document the kingdom's record contained, not because the campaign had been the largest in the kingdom's history, but because the intelligence basis for it had been documented with a completeness that conventional military campaigns rarely achieved. Every prediction, every timing estimate, every configuration reading, cross-referenced against the ground truth confirmation from the conventional intelligence network. The star map record was more accurate than the field reports on 31 of 37 significant developments. Marin's assessment named the Star Navigator function as the campaign's decisive intelligence advantage. She did not attend the session. She was in the watchtower, reading the post-campaign star map with the relaxed, unhurried attention of someone whose instrument had been running at sustained high output for 8 weeks and was being allowed to operate at the pace it found natural. Evander came to the watchtower that evening without the kitchen preparation, which she noticed and interpreted as a change in the routine that signaled the end of the crisis period and the beginning of whatever came after it. He said, "The campaign assessment has been entered into the permanent military record." He said, "Your name is in it 27 times. She said, "I will need to update the Notation Archive's indexing system to cross-reference with the campaign record's specific sites." She said it in the tone of someone noting an administrative task which was also its own kind of quiet acknowledgement of what 27 citations meant. He sat beside her on the platform in the way he sat now, the ease of someone who had been sitting in this specific spot for 8 weeks and had stopped being a guest in it and had started being a presence. She said, "The Blood Moon Ceremony Protocol Amendment." He said, "In effect as of last week." He said, "The formal announcement was distributed to all court members with the specific language about prior written consent." She said, "And the security investigation." He said, "Hadron's cooperation with the investigation produced a full account of the water level intelligence's transmission." He said, "The account names 2 additional participants in the transmission chain, both of whom were court members with access to the border assessment records." He said, "All 3 are under formal prosecution. The investigation's findings are in the permanent record." She said, "And the investigation's connection to the Blood Moon ceremony." He said, "Explicit in the permanent record, as you requested at the council session." He said, "The formal record contains both the Blood Moon ceremony's account and the security investigation's findings in the same document, with the connection between them noted." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I have been building the evidence base." He said, I know. She said, the evidence base is sufficient. He looked at her. She said, the constitutional role, the charter amendment, the blood moon protocol revision, the investigation's permanent record, the watchtower designation, the kitchen preparation from the fourth day. She said, all of it. She said, and the mountain. She said, you climbed the mountain alone. He said, I climbed the mountain alone. She said, that was the most significant data point. He said nothing. He was doing the specific thing she had watched him learn to do over 8 weeks of watchtower evenings, receiving what she said without rushing to fill it with a response. Allowing what was true to exist in the space between them without immediately requiring it to become something else. She took his hand. Not dramatically. Simply. The specific, unceremonious directness of a person who had decided that what they were reaching for was what they were reaching for and did not require a frame around it. He was still for a moment. Then he said quietly, I have been in love with you for approximately 2.5 years. She said, I know. She said, I have known for approximately 2 years. She said, the last 6 months I have been waiting for you to catch up. He said, I am caught up. She said, the evidence supports that assessment. He said, are you always going to describe things in terms of evidence? She said, I am always going to describe things accurately. Evidence is how I describe accurate things. He said, I can work with that. She said, you said that on the mountain. He said, it was true on the mountain. It is still true. She looked at the sky above the watchtower's open platform, the post-campaign stars in their settled configurations. The 4 sectors quiet in the ways of situations that had resolved. The western horizon finally fully visible from this height in a way it had not been from the valley window she had spent 2 years watching from. She had the full sky now. She had built a function that would outlast her. She had standing that did not depend on anyone's willingness to speak. She had a role that was constitutionally protected and institutionally real, and named in the permanent record 27 times. She was still here. She had stopped waiting for someone to choose her. She had chosen herself, and then she had chosen this, and the 2 choices were not in conflict. 5 years forward. The Star Navigator function had 3 additional practitioners. The first was a young man from the kingdom's northeastern province who had come to the watchtower in the function's 2nd year with a letter from his village elder describing a specific and unusual capacity he had demonstrated since childhood, not star reading exactly, but weather pattern reading in the stars. A variant of the celestial gift that produced operational intelligence of a different kind, accurate long-range weather prediction, specifically useful for naval planning and harvest assessment. 2 domains the conventional forecasting infrastructure had never served adequately. Seraphine had assessed him in 3 sessions and confirmed the gift's operational validity and trained him in the notation system's foundational principles and adapted the system for his variant-specific outputs. He was the watchtower's 2nd practitioner within 6 months of his arrival. The second was a woman from the southern border settlements whose gift read not military movement, but the emotional condition of large populations in the stars above their territory, not individual people, never individual people, but the collective quality of a community's stability or instability registered in the specific color shifts of the relevant star clusters. Her intelligence had proven invaluable for the diplomatic function, allowing the kingdom's envoys to approach negotiation with accurate foreknowledge of the other party's collective disposition. She had been found through the network that Seraphine had built in the 3rd year, a formal inquiry system sent to provincial archivists and community leaders across the kingdom's territory, asking whether anyone knew of individuals with unusual sky-reading capacities who might not know what those capacities were or what they could be used for. The inquiry had produced 11 responses in the first 6 months. The 3rd practitioner was still in training, a girl of 15 from the western border settlements whose gift was the most unusual of the four. She read the star map not as a current picture, but as a projection. Seeing configurations that corresponded not to current military situations, but to situations that were forming the pre-consolidation phase, the gathering that preceded the gathering. Early warning at a depth that Seraphine's own gift did not reach. She was learning the notation system with the specific intensity of someone who had been carrying something without language for it for 15 years, and had finally been given the language. Seraphine recognized this quality. She taught her with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what 15 years of carrying a gift without language felt like. The Blood Moon Ceremony's protocol amendment had been in effect for 4 years. In those 4 years, no individual's standing had been publicly processed without their prior written consent. The amendment had been tested once an administrative clerk had attempted to use the old ceremonial format for a standing registration, and the challenge had been raised through the constitutional protection mechanism Seraphine had written into the charter, addressed in 3 days, and entered into the permanent record as the protocol amendment's first formal enforcement instance. The enforcement record was public. The clerk had been reassigned. Lord Hadron's prosecution had concluded in the 3rd year with a formal finding of security breach and standing revocation. His 2 allied generals had been prosecuted separately on the border defense coordination charges that Marin's investigation had substantiated. All 3 findings were in the permanent military record alongside the campaign documentation. Seraphine had attended the findings session not to observe Hadron's outcome, but to ensure that the Blood Moon Ceremony's connection to the security investigation remained explicit in the final record. It did. The security investigation had also produced a full accounting of how the Western forces' intelligence advantage had been assembled, a 6-month operation coordinated through the courts' administrative structure by people who had understood that suppressing border intelligence was operationally equivalent to providing the kingdom's enemies with border intelligence. This finding had been the basis for the administrative reform that Seraphine had proposed in the 3rd year. A standing external review mechanism for the War Council's intelligence function, conducted annually by an independent panel that included the Star Navigator function's senior practitioner. The Southeastern Kingdom had eventually sought a diplomatic resolution in the campaign's 2nd year. The star map had shown Seraphine the moment when the Southeastern commander's assessment of the campaign's long-term viability shifted from optimistic to realistic, which she had reported to the diplomatic team with the specific timing recommendation that they make contact within the following 10 days while the shift was fresh. The diplomatic team had made contact. The resolution had been negotiated in 6 weeks. The resolution document was in the permanent record alongside the military campaign documentation as an example of intelligence-enabled diplomacy. The Western River crossing had been the subject of a border management review in the campaign's immediate aftermath. The review had produced a formal assessment of all border points previously classified as impassable, and had identified 3 additional crossings whose passability was dependent on variable water levels. All 3 were now incorporated into the defensive planning framework with appropriate monitoring protocols. The drought-sensitive crossing that the 4th Force had used was monitored by a water level station that Seraphine had recommended placing there on the basis of the star map's continuing western configuration patterns. The watchtower had been expanded in the 2nd year, a 2nd platform added at a slightly higher elevation, accessible by an interior stairway that allowed work in poor weather conditions the original open platform had not accommodated. Seraphine had specified the expansion's design requirements, which were practical rather than aesthetic: the platform height, the horizon clearance, the wind protection that allowed sustained work without the cold becoming a physiological impediment rather than a clarifying condition. She still used the original platform when the weather allowed. She used it on clear nights the way she had used it since the campaign's first week, with both hands on the stone rail and the gift fully open, and the 4 sectors reading in the near simultaneous way the tower's height enabled. The borders had been quiet for 3 years. Quiet in the star map registered as the settled, low-density configurations of territories operating in their ordinary rhythms, rather than mobilizing toward extraordinary ones. She documented the quiet with the same methodical thoroughness she had documented the crisis. Because the record of what quiet looked like was as operationally valuable as the record of what invasion looked like. It established the baseline against which future deviations would be assessed. There were 2 children. The boy was 4 years old, and he sat on the watchtower's lower steps on clear evenings and watched the sky with the specific focused attention of someone learning something important. He had not yet demonstrated a gift, and she was not watching for one, she was watching him learn to pay attention to the sky, which was the prerequisite for everything else, and which no gift could substitute for. She showed him the star clusters she read, by name and by position, the way she had learned them herself by looking consistently over a long period, until the looking produced understanding. The girl was 2 years old, and she reached for the sky when she was held up toward it, both small hands extended. The gesture so specifically reminiscent of the palms to stone contact of the reading position that Seraphine noted it privately without comment. It might be nothing. It might be the beginning of something. Either way, she would not be told that her sky-reaching was a powerful imagination she should be careful about. She would be shown the stars and taught their names, and given every condition that allowed whatever she was to develop at its own pace. On a clear autumn evening in the 5th year, Seraphine stood on the original watchtower platform with both hands on the stone rail and read the 4 sectors in sequence with the passive, relaxed gift reading of a routine evening assessment. The stars were settled and ordinary and showed her the kingdom's borders in their quiet configurations. She documented the quiet. She stayed on the platform for a while after the documentation was complete. The way she sometimes stayed, not working, simply present, the gift operating at its ambient level. The sky above her, the sky she had been looking at for 25 years and would look at for however many more she had. Evander came up the stairs at the usual hour. He sat beside her on the platform, and she told him what the stars showed, as she had told him every clear evening for 5 years, the specific, undecorated operational summary of the kingdom's strategic situation as the sky encoded it. He listened with the quality of attention he had been developing since the mountain. The attention that was not the skim of a king processing a summary, but the genuine comprehension of someone who had been learning this language for 5 years and was becoming, in the specific way of a person who has committed to learning something, progressively more fluent in it. She said, "The borders are quiet." He said, "What does quiet look like tonight?" She said, "Like the sky above a kingdom that has been through something significant and has arrived at the other side of it." He said, "Is that different from ordinary quiet?" She said, "Yes." She said, "Ordinary quiet is the absence of specific activity. This quality of quiet is a settled quality, the specific configuration of a situation that has been through acute and sustained phases and has found its stable state." She said, "It feels different in the gifts register." He said, "It feels like what?" She pressed both palms flat to the cold stone rail and read the sky with the full depth the tower's height allowed, and then she said, "It feels like the beginning of something that will last." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Good." She looked at the stars above the watchtower's open platform, the 4 sectors in their settled configurations, the western horizon fully visible, the full sky available to her in a way the valley window had never permitted. She was still here. The sky was showing her everything. She was no longer carrying it alone. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.